We are live in all the places. Let me just get this. Okay, that's what I wanted to see. All right, everyone. So today, oops, are we live over there? Yeah, we are. Okay. Today I want to talk a little bit about processed foods. And this partially comes from the fact that in the Shift membership, we are doing a book club, Reading the Hungry Brain. And so I'm deep into a revisiting of the research on why our brains choose certain foods, and I'm heavy into it right now. Some of the other members on here are as well. And I love sharing the information as it's processing through me, and I'm in deep study of it. And so I don't talk a whole lot about actual food, right? You don't hear me talk a whole lot about, eat this or don't eat that, or this ratio of macronutrients. I don't do a whole lot of that because the research is really, really clear. And please don't shoot the messenger, but the research is really, really clear that when we do a meta-analysis, meaning when we step back and look at an overall analysis of all of the research and all of the study on different, quote, diets, or I'm just going to say ways of eating, meaning when you are controlling for your macronutrient content. So whether it's high carb, low fat, or low carb, high fat, or high protein, medium carbohydrate, whatever it is, when you're accounting for, when you control for calories in a study, meaning, let me slow this down and back up and say, in the studies they've done, looking at when you control for just the calories, meaning everybody in a controlled environment gets the same number of calories, but all they do is change the macronutrient content. So they will change the ratio of carbohydrate to fat, or change the ratio of carbohydrate to protein to fat, right? When they keep the calories the same for everybody and all they do is change the macronutrient ratio, okay? And then they look at all of the studies that compare all of those what they've done, right? So they look at all the studies that compare what they've done. So there's a meta-analysis of studies going on. They do the studies, they control for the macronutrients. Then they compare the studies. Yes, that's what a meta-analysis is. You do the studies, and then the meta-analysis is comparing all the studies. Got it? So when we compare all of the studies, when we do a meta-analysis of the different type of macronutrient content, there's really very little variance in how well each, quote, diet works, truly. There's very little variance. And as the people in my Shift program know, that really the biggest factor, that is the determining factor of whether or not that diet works, is whether or not you will stick to it. So for that reason, it is the most important thing when we're looking at a way of eating. You'll hear me talk about a diet as your way of eating. The most important thing when we look at a way of eating is your ability to stick to it, that it is sustainable for you. And there's a number of factors that determine that, but that's not the topic of today's talk. So that all came from the reason that I don't talk a whole lot about diet and nutrition is because truly we have overcomplicated all of it and said, oh, well, it's this macronutrient and this protein and this ratio and this, and this, that, and whatever. When you boil down to it under a research microscope, the basics remain the same. There needs to be a calorie deficit if you are going to change the shape of your body. The difference between macronutrient only really matters so much as whether or not you'll stick to it. And it needs to be consistent over time. It's like, this is why I say don't shoot the messenger, is we've made it super, super complicated. Like, well, but is it this? And but is it this? And but is it this? The truth is you need to be in a calorie deficit consistent over time. Now, here's where the complications come in. Is that there's a number of variables and a number of factors that determine whether or not someone will stick to a program. And there's a number of variables and factors that come into play that will trigger you to eat differently, that will trigger the mechanisms in the background, your unconscious behaviors that will have you reaching for food, right? But then you need the quote willpower to overcome. There are a number of variables that will, to make it simple, there are a number of variables that will cause you to eat. But the actual formula for weight gain and weight loss remains the same. There has to be a calorie surplus or a calorie deficit, period. And we know that from really breaking down the science of what calories are in the body. I just got done, my shift membership folks know this. I just got done reading one of the most boring, God bless you, but the most boring books I've ever read. I shouldn't say boring, very, very science heavy on the Krebs cycle and how we metabolize food and what a calorie is and what it does with energy. The book, Why Calories Don't Count. Really interesting book, but very, very science heavy. I'm deep into the book, revisiting right now. I've already read it a few times, but revisiting the book, The Hungry Brain, which again talks about, breaks it down from a truly simple scientific level of, what happens when we eat and what happens to the energy in the body. And on the very basic level, we have to be in a calorie deficit for a consistent period of time in order for the body to let go of weight. Now, the part that gets confusing or that gets complicated is that there are a number of factors, some within our conscious awareness and many that are not, that drive us to eat, Now, those who know me and who are with me in other areas know that many of these factors are around our body's safety cues and safety signals, right? Physical, mental, emotional safety cues and signals. And then some of them are around what is actually in our food, which is what I wanted to talk about today. So when we talk about not eating processed food, most people think, oh, well, processed food is bad for you, right? Like, the calories are not good for you and it's got junk food in it and you shouldn't be eating processed food. While all that is true, many people don't understand that the processed food itself contains some of the risk factors for overeating food. And so when I tell people, one of the things that I talk about most when I talk about nutrition, I don't talk about, oh, eat this diet or that diet or whatever very much. But when I do, I talk about staying away from processed food as much as possible for two reasons. Number one, the processed food itself, the way that it's engineered and the way that those ingredients communicate with your brain will cause you to eat more food. There are a number of studies that show this, but if I'm going to boil it down to simplicity, eating processed food will cause you to eat more food because of the mechanisms that it trigger in the brain. Because of the way that the ingredients are unnaturally combined together, the more processed food you eat, the more processed food you'll eat. It is triggering your brain in an unnatural way to reach for that food, okay? The second reason is that the impact of processed food on your body, the inflammatory response that processed food has on your body, the disruption of the gut microbiome and the gut lining that it has on your body will also cause you to eat more food. So not only will the ingredients trigger the brain chemistry to have you eat more food, then you've got the impact of eating it on the inflammatory system and the inflammatory response to cause you to eat more food. And so here you are in this yo-yo cycle when you get into eating processed foods that keep you on that cycle. There's so much I want to say about this, but I want to try and keep it simple. When I talk about, in my programs, I give people options of how to monitor their food intake, And some people will say, well, Eliza, counting calories is out, right? Like counting calories is out. Everybody says that's, we shouldn't do that anymore. It's not just calories in, calories out. Now listen to that statement. it's not just calories in, calories out. That is true. It is not just, but it is still relevant. It is still relevant. We do this thing in nutrition where we throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? When we hear it's not just calories in, calories out, we go, oh, it's not calories in, calories out anymore, you know? And we're not listening to the actual statement, which is it's not just calories in, calories out. That remains truer than it's ever been. That the amount of calories we eat, and I say calories by literal units of energy, the amount of fuel and energy we consume still very, very much matters if you're working on maintaining a healthy weight. Meaning, why am I saying this? Meaning it is still incredibly important that you have a way of monitoring your food intake. I don't care if it's counting calories or counting macronutrients or counting portion sizes or just doesn't matter. Some way to be aware and accountable of what you are consuming, because it is still necessary to be in a deficit when you are trying to lose weight. It is still necessary. That remains true. And when people say it's not just calories in, calories out, now we go into the, well, what else is it? Calories in, calories out still matters. And I think that's something that, man, it's been so diluted that people throw it out altogether. It still does very much matter. Now, I won't go into it today because, man, could I go down this rabbit hole, but a huge mistake we make with creating a calorie deficit is that we create too low of a calorie deficit, way too low of a calorie deficit. And that has a whole host of other issues, but I'll leave you with that. When we're creating a calorie deficit, it doesn't need to be drastic, okay? The other issue that comes in with energy intake is what type of energy intake is it? And is the type of energy intake creating an environment in the body which triggers the body to consume more energy? And that was the whole point of today's talk, is that processed foods. Now, let me just quickly say a thing about processed food. Well, I'll finish that thought, then I'll say it. Processed food creates an environment in the body which triggers you to eat more food, both unconscious, right, and consciously triggers you to eat more food. Number of studies done, the people who are eating processed food eat considerably more than people who don't eat processed food, okay? Because of the food itself and because of the environment that it creates in the body, the inflammatory response. All right, now, what am I saying when I talk about processed food? I think that is incredibly important because technically, milk is a processed food. Technically, plain unsweetened yogurt is a processed food. On a technicality, even just doing something to the food is considered food processing, meaning if you have to heat it to store it or take something out of it to get it to store or something like that, it is a processed food. If you have to change the way that the food presents, meaning wheat, when you pull wheat from the stem, you have to process it to do something to make it into bread. Technically, that's a processed food, right? Same thing with rice, even. You have to take it from the paddy and process it in order to make it an edible form for us. So food processing has a spectrum. What we're really talking about here is what's considered ultra-processed foods. And these are everything that you know are ultra-processed foods, right? Chips, cookies, crackers, Oreos, Doritos, that kind of stuff. But there is also somewhat of a spectrum of ultra-processed foods, aren't there? In other words, when you look at plain Greek yogurt, for example, and you look at the back of the label and there's just a couple of ingredients, versus when you look at Yoplait, quote, Greek yogurt, and there's 30 ingredients on the back, you can see a visual representation of how much the food is processed. You know how I like to simplify things. And so my rule of thumb is, and truly this is how we talk about things with my daughter. And she's 9, and we do a lot of talking about balance. We do a lot of talking about, what nutrients are. And she knows that when you look at the back of a label and there's 30 ingredients on there and you can't recognize any of them, that's an indicator that there is a chemical response going on in your body where your body's trying to figure out what the heck that food is. And most of the time, your body doesn't know what to do with it. And so the more of those foods you eat, the more of that response is going to happen in the body. And so if I was going to give anybody blanket nutrition, just blanket nutrition, and let me tell you, if you saw the number of nutrition books that I have on my library and have read and poured through and read again and read again and read again with all the research and all the literature from every angle, the thread that is common, the only thread that is common in all of them is that we got to stop eating processed foods. That quite literally the impact of the processed food industry on our health, longevity, chronic illness, autoimmune disorders, obesity, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, all of it with this inflammatory response can be linked correlationally, not causational, correlational, which means it's connected, but not necessarily cause. All of them agree that processed food stands at the forefront of a lot of our medical issues. And so if you were to only do one thing, literally only one thing with your nutrition, it would be to reduce the number of processed foods that you eat by as much as you're willing. By as much as you're willing. And if you're not willing, and this is what I talk about in the SHIFT program, if you're not willing, then it becomes imperative that you closely monitor your food intake through calories or portions or whatever it is. Because what I can promise you is that if you are consuming a decent amount of processed food, your brain is being triggered to eat considerably more food and considerably more processed foods at that. So you are at a significant, you're up against a significant challenge when you're eating processed foods to be able to successfully regulate your food intake. Okay? That is the point of today's healthy conversation, is that if I was going to give the best piece of nutritional advice that is true across the board for everybody who is working on weight management in some way, forget it, not even everybody who's working on weight management, everyone across the board of every shape and size. If you are looking to be healthy, free of disease, free of body image struggles, free of weight struggle, whatever it is, reducing your processed food intake as much as humanly possible is going to get you there quicker, is going to make you healthier. Hands down, the best piece of nutrition advice I can give. Okay, hopefully that helped today. Let me just see over here. Hey, Margie. Awesome. Okay. Any other questions? Doesn't look like there's any questions over there. Any questions in the Zoom group? Not over here either. I will see you next week for more healthy conversations. Bye, everyone.